Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Dietrich.
Jenny, I think we need to go out and hire some senior citizens. They'll do this podcast for us.
Okay.
I would say
Senior
right after this, but we
citizen.
don't do that little ditty music here anymore because we just have it before anyway. But no, not senior citizens, but we are going to talk about seniors, and that's senior hires, and whether or
Senior
not
professional.
whether you should hire and staff your agency with primarily senior level talent. And I know this is something that's very popular amongst some small agencies, particularly as they're getting started. Maybe they're getting started with a couple of partners with real experience. And so it's all senior on that basis. It might be
Mhm.
that as you hire, you want to hire people who are like you or closer to you in experience so that you can offer that same level of service to your clients by having people who have that level of experience.
Mhm.
And there are certainly some pros to that, but there are also some significant cons that you need to think of before you have an agency that is staffed almost entirely by seniors or completely by seniors.
Yeah. I mean, as I've grown my agency, one of the things I've looked at is doing that as well. And one of the pros for me is, it takes a lot to coach and mentor a young professional. And we've been virtual for a very long time, long before even the pandemic. And it's really hard. It's really challenging to bring in a young professional in that environment as well. So I've looked at the pros and cons for my own agency. It's expensive, really expensive, and you may not get the same return that you do with some younger professionals. But in the end, what I have found is a good mix is usually for us the right place to be.
Yeah, and as always, it depends, right? And
Yep.
there
Yep.
are models that work, and certainly there are some boutique consulting firms that have only senior level people, and they can make a very good living. But part of the challenge is because it's expensive, it means that you also need to be expensive to your clients.
Yep.
Right. So if you're going to staff with high level, high priced people, that's okay as long as you can command the appropriate rates from your clients, which typically means you're doing a higher level of
Yep.
service for them. You are primarily providing strategic and not doing the day-to-day of issuing press releases and doing media relations and all of those kinds of things that become really challenging to do economically if everybody is a senior.
Yeah, and you will find that most people with several years of experience don't want to do that work anymore, right? I mean, they spend the first parts of their careers doing that. So asking them to do media relations or write news releases or even manage communities of social media is not where they want to spend their time. They want to spend their time on the higher level stuff. So you have to figure out if that's the kind of agency that you have, or if your agency is all about being extra arms and legs for clients and doing the execution of campaigns, that you have to have a good mix of different levels of experience in there.
Well, I think that mix is so important because there are kinds of work that you need to do that, as you point out, the seniors don't want to do and that are also not economical. And so if you've got
Mhm.
a good mix, you can still offer that high level of service. I think the biggest challenge is as you're getting started in the early stages when you're 2, 3, 4 employees, how do you balance this out? Because it's really challenging at that point if you want to have more seniors than just yourself. How do you price it effectively
Yeah.
for it to make sense? And so, I always encourage folks to model things out and say, okay, well, if this is how I was staffed and this is how we were doing work, what would be my actual cost to service this client? And can I do it profitably or not? Because, and I see this all the time with agencies who have partners, right? If you start an agency with more than one owner, it's always challenging because that means from revenue level, the first dollar, you now have two mouths, two expensive mouths to
Hmm.
feed.
Yep.
And it's hard enough getting started in a business solo, much harder when you've got two or three or more all at once. And so you need to think through and map it out. How does this work? How do we price to make this work? Can we actually sell that much revenue in order to be successful?
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that agency owners tend to do, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, but we tend to say, oh, well, my time is free, or I don't have to pay myself, a living salary. I'll get on the back end. And when you have senior level employees, not only do you have to pay them what they would get command anywhere else, but you have to pay yourself the same or more than they're getting. So it becomes pretty expensive. But to your point, if you map it out and say, okay, this is how we're going to generate revenue to cover our expenses, which is that's what they are, is expensive, yourself included. It can be done for sure.
Yeah, and I think part of it is also trying to sit down and say, okay, do I really need this senior level? I mean, I think sometimes we do it out of comfort because we like to work
Sure,
with
sure.
smarter, more experienced people because we
Absolutely.
feel like
Yep.
that's going to be easier to manage. I would dispute that. I think some very senior employees are actually more difficult to manage than juniors. It's just it's different kinds of management, but I mean, I've worked with plenty of senior folks who are just really tough from a managerial
So bye.
perspective
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
they
Yep.
come in with preconceived notions of everything and a way of doing things that is not
Yep.
yours. And
Yep.
it's really hard. I mean, if I go in somewhere as an employee today, it's going to be really hard to convince me to do things differently than I've done them for the last 30 years.
Absolutely. Yes.
And so if you bring in someone with 10 or 20 years of experience, they're going to be the same way in all likelihood. And so you're going to have to really shape them into what you want. And so you need to ask yourself, do I really need this? Or is it just out of comfort or the concept that I'm going for here? And so that really comes down to understanding, and you should do this with every new hire. What do I actually need them to do? What value do I need to get from them? Because I think a lot of times, if you go through that exercise, you'll find that only a very, very small percentage of what they're doing would actually benefit from their that senior level of experience. And if it's only 10% of their time requires that, that may not be the best for your agency to hire at that level.
And one of the things we talked about last week is letting it go and giving up control. And if you're not yet to that position and you still are having a hard time letting it go and giving up control, you're going to have a lot harder time with a senior level employee who comes in. They won't last long because if you're micromanaging them or you are trying to control the work that they do, or to your point, trying to make them do things the way that you want them done when they've spent 20 or 30 years doing it their way, like those things are going to create conflict pretty fast. So you also have to take a really good inward look and say, okay, am I a micromanager? Do I like to have control? Am I unwilling to give it up and to let it go? And if the answer to those things is yes, then a senior level employee is not the right fit for you. Now, you'd listen to last week's episode to learn why all of those things should change. But if that's where you are right now in your journey, do not bring in a senior level employee because it will create all sorts of animosity.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't let go, please, please do not waste your money on a senior hire
Yes.
because the last thing you want is a senior hire that you don't even allow to work at a senior level because you feel
Yes.
compelled to micromanage them. Because now you've
Correct.
gotten the worst of both worlds. You're spending too
Uh-huh.
much and you're not actually helping yourself. So
Yes.
absolutely listen to last week's episode. Understand that you need to let it go, and that has to be part of the equation before you even think about it. But I think even more than that, you need to think about if the person is not going to be doing a lot of senior level work, can you come in and just, sprinkle the magic dust that I like to talk about as an agency owner? And that is sufficient because you can get everything else off of your plate with, say, a mid-level hire or
Yeah.
even a more junior hire. As I think everybody knows, I don't endorse most small agencies hiring true junior entry level type employees. I think that's a mistake. But you can get someone with 2 or 3 years of experience who's had the business potty training, as I like to call it, so you don't have
The
to go through
business
that.
body training.
Right. I mean, I want potty trained employees. As a small agency, I don't want to have to spend time explaining to you how do you, what is
Fair.
Zoom etiquette? How do you,
Totally
what is the
fair.
basics of press
Yes.
release writing
Yes.
or, how do you judge what to post on,
Yes.
social media, those
Yes.
let someone else deal with all of that.
That's
But
the
I can
best
still get someone in
analogy.
with 2 or 3 years of experience for a lot less than someone with 10 or
Yeah.
15.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
so you really need to be clear with yourself. Do I really need somebody with that level of experience before you commit to spending that kind of money?
Yeah. I mean, just like anything else and anything else that we talk about, you have to outline the pros and the cons. What are the pros? What are the cons? And where is my agency in its maturity right now? because I've been through this as well. I went through the whole process of hiring junior level employees and coaching them and mentoring and doing all those things, which was fun. And I went through the process of hiring only senior level employees, and that also was fun. So you have to figure out what works for you in the moment. And it's going to change. It's going to evolve. It's going to change, as you grow, as your business matures. So be okay with that fluidity as well. Like understand what works right now may not work in a year or 5 years from now. And that's okay. That's totally okay.
I love that you note that it will change over time. In fact, my view is that every hire changes your next hire. So it's why I always advise against whether you're in a large organization within a team hiring more than one person at a time, or your small agency hiring more than one person at a time. Every time you hire one individual, it changes the entire team dynamic, and it changes what in
Yep.
all likelihood you need in that next hire.
Great point. Great
And
point.
so it is every single time you bring that new person in the door, it's going to change what you need next. And you don't really know how, because
Hmm.
until you see how the team dynamic evolves and you really understand what that person has, because I mean, let's face it, when you hire somebody, it's based off of a couple of hours of conversation
Right.
most,
Right.
at
Right.
most.
At most.
You
Correct.
know very little
Yes.
about
Yes.
that person that you're hiring, and so until they actually come in, you don't really know what you have. You got a
Yeah.
a general idea based on their experience and the conversations you've had, but you don't really know. And you might find, geez, they're really good at this, and so now that's a problem I don't have that I thought I did, but they're weak in some other area that I need to shore up the next time I hire. So be prepared for things to change. And I think that it's a helpful exercise to reflect and not just assume, okay, well, my next hire is this. I was planning on this hire today and another hire this summer, and this is what they look like, and just sticking with that plan blindly. You need to update it as things evolve in your business.
Yeah. And I would say one of the things too, one of the challenges I've had is I, it's on the spin suck side. I would call it more of a media company than an agency. And as we were building that and creating content that would become productized, I hired somebody who had done that for a magazine. And so I thought it would be an easy transition for him to go from one to the other. And it didn't work. It didn't work. We ended up hating one another. It was a disaster. And, hindsight, of course, is 2020, but reflecting back on that, from my perspective, I expected him to come in and take his experience and translate it directly and help me grow that side of the business. From his perspective, he had never done that before. He'd always worked for a magazine that had, a publishing side and advertising and all of the resources he needed to be able to do the right kinds of editorial, which we didn't have because we were just starting out. And so there was a lot of things that got lost in the communication of it. Um, and he also wanted to be bonused on certain milestones that we never met because it didn't translate the same way. And I think that I wasn't mature enough in my business growth, and he didn't understand what it was like on the sort of the other side of things. So but same thing. We'd had a few really great conversations. We were on the same path, like from a vision perspective, we just couldn't make the execution of it work. So, like, you have to understand that if you're going to bring in somebody with experience and they have experience in something really specific like that, it may not translate the same way. So you have to kind of figure all those pieces out. And sometimes it is trial and error, which sucks, but sometimes that's the way to do it too.
Well, this idea of understanding the kind of experience they have is so important, because oftentimes I see small agencies wanting to hire someone in and say, okay, they've got this great senior level of experience with an Edelman or a large agency of some
Right.
kind.
Yep.
And then you bring
Yep.
them in.
Yep.
And so for junior
Yes.
hires, it's less of an issue what kind of organization they've come from. Right? You can learn a little bit about it, but they're still early enough on that, and they were junior enough that you probably have room to work. But if you hire someone with senior level experience, they're going to be very influenced by where they've come from, whether that's a large
Absolutely.
agency or a
Yep.
client side or something like that. And you really, really want to make sure that if you're hiring senior people for your agency, they have relevant experience in a small organization like yours. because a senior level role in a small agency is very different from a senior level
Yeah.
role in a large agency or on the client side or something like that, where you've got larger teams. And so you're not responsible for the same kind of stuff
Yeah.
that you've got to do if you're on a team of 5 or 10 or 15. And
Yeah.
so understanding that, I mean, that can be a huge cultural disconnect if you bring in somebody who is, used to having people who help them with everything.
Right.
And now all of a sudden they have the title. It sounds good. They're chief operating officer, they're executive vice president, or something like that. And yet they are also having to, wash the dishes or whatever, I mean, but
Right.
that's the reality of a small
Yeah.
agency, right?
It is a
Everybody has to do
reality.
a little
Right.
bit of everything.
Right. 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 I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Somebody at that level is typically not going to want to write the news releases and manage the social media, right? They're going to want to do really strategic stuff. And in some cases, to your point, they're accustomed to having teams of people, not one or two people, but teams of people who are doing the work underneath them. So they are able to do strategic work where doing strategic work in your agency may look differently. So I have a really good friend who works for one of the big agencies and all he does is crisis work. And he has enough experience that literally what they do is they send him in when there's a crisis on the day of. And he says, this is what you need to do. Boom, 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 boom. And then he leaves to go to the next and the team comes in to execute. So if you hire somebody like that in your agency, it's not going to work because there's no, you can't, there's no infrastructure to support someone like that in the way that they've become accustomed to.
Right. And I think it's so important that, I mean, with all new hires, but particularly at the senior level, that you have expectations set clearly during
Yes.
the interview process.
Yes.
And so if there
Yes.
are parts of the job
Yes.
that are going to suck, make sure the potential new hire knows
They
that
know.
before day one, because it doesn't do you any good to convince them to join. And then they find out, oh, I don't
Right.
have anybody to boss
Right.
around. I don't have anybody to help me with this or that. It's all on me. Make
Yeah.
sure they know that. And so I think a really helpful exercise in trying to figure out both what you need as well as being able to set the expectation is to map out a 40-hour work week for your potential new hire. How do
Love
you
that.
see them actually spending time? I mean, that helps you
Love
understand
that.
what you really need and that
Yep.
this person
Yep.
is a real fit, but it
Love that.
allows you to share with that new hire, here's what your week might look like. And
Yeah.
if it's going to be, 8 or 10 hours of press release writing and database updating, tell them that.
Yeah. Yeah.
They may still say yes to something that they shouldn't, but at least you did it in a way that you allowed them to have their eyes open and that they didn't
Right.
walk in on day one and think, this is a total shocker to me.
That's such great advice in general. Anytime you hire somebody, map out what 40 hours will look like so that you understand what you're asking them to do and they understand what they're walking into. That's great advice no matter who you're hiring. Such good advice.
And that helps you figure out, is this what I really need?
Right.
Because a lot of times you think I cannot tell you the number of times I've talked with agency owners who tell me that, I need to hire, someone to just, do project management or operations or that kind of stuff. In fact, almost every agency owner I talk with says that's the first hire I need to get. The reality is there's probably not that much truly operational. It depends on the business. There are agencies that do require it, but the vast majority don't really have 40 hours a week of that. And
Right.
so what are you going to fill the rest of their time with?
Yep.
And when you're
Yep.
thinking about senior hires, is if only 4 hours of their 40 is truly senior level advising clients and relationship and that kind of stuff, is that what you really need? Or could you
Yep.
do those 4 hours and find someone else to fill the other 36
That's right.
who's at a more
Yes.
junior, more affordable
Yes.
level?
And then you're happier. So much.
Right, because the end result is what matters here, right? It's not some
Right.
title on a piece of paper
Right.
or what, some expert like one of us tells you to do. I mean, by all means, if we're wrong for your agency and you need all senior hires and that's really what works, great, do it. We're
Great.
not telling you
Right.
not to.
Yes. Right.
We're just telling you think really hard before you
Yep.
do that, because more often than not, it becomes more difficult if you have very senior, very expensive mouths to feed on a regular basis.
Yeah. Yes,
So
indeed.
with that, I think it's time for me to go get some lunch and feed this mouth. So I think we'll draw this episode, the Agency Leadership Podcast, to a close. I'm Chip Griffin,
I'm Jenny Dietrich.
and it depends.